Good morning, everyone. Today, I will present a wrongful conviction case involving David Camm, a former Indiana state trooper in the United States. In September 2000, Camm discovered his wife and two children murdered in their home garage. Although he claimed he was playing basketball at a church during the murders, investigators quickly focused on him as the main suspect. This case became highly controversial because of questionable forensic evidence, unreliable bloodstain analysis, and prosecutorial misconduct. After being convicted twice and spending 13 years in prison, David Camm was finally acquitted during his third trial in 2013. This case is now widely discussed as an example of how forensic errors and investigative bias can lead to wrongful convictions. The case began on September 28, 2000, when David Camm returned home and found his wife Kimberly and their two children dead from gunshot wounds inside the garage. Police immediately suspected Camm because bloodstains were found on his shirt. Prosecutors claimed the stains were high-velocity blood spatter, which they argued proved he was the shooter. However, defense expert later explained that the stains could have been transferred onto his shirt while he tried to save his son and move the bodies. During the first trial in 2002, the prosecution also used evidence on Camm past extramarital affairs to influence the jury, and he was convicted. In 2004, the conviction was overturned because the court ruled that the evidence unfairly biased the jury. Later, DNA found on the sweatshirt at the crime scene matched Charles Bonney, a convicted felon with a history of violent crimes against women. Despite this, Camm was convicted again in the second trial before the conviction was also overturned. Finally, in 2013, after new forensic reviews and stronger DNA evidence, the jury found David Camm not guilty, while Charles Bonney remained convicted for the murders.
The David Camm case is a legal anomaly, a perfect storm of forensic contradiction. What makes it unique isn't just the crime, but the evolution of the suspect profile. First, consider the purple sweatshirt. The investigator found a grey sweatshirt at the scene. In a standard investigation, this will be a high priority item or evidence, yet it sat in evidence for years while the focus remained solely on David Camm. When DNA was finally run, it hit on Charles Bonney, a man with a history of stalking and shoe fetish. This introduced a unique legal hurdle, which is that the state had to explain how suburban father and violent felon were suddenly partnered in crime without a single phone cell or meeting to link them. Second, the expert credential crisis. This case is uniquely cited in forensic textbook because of Robert's side. He was presented as an expert but was actually a photographer with minimal training. This highlights a unique systemic failure where the court allowed a non-expert to define the site of the trial. Finally, we have the contamination narrative. The scene was crowded with the first responder, many of whom were Camm's former colleagues. This created a unique observable effect where personal emotion and pre-existing bias influenced how the initial evidence was collected and perceived.
Now we will proceed to the part of problems investigators and prosecutors that face in this case. Investigators and prosecutors face several key challenges in this case. Firstly, they needed to determine whether David Camm was the shooter or an innocent individual who discovered the bodies, as there were no eyewitnesses to confirm the actual events, so the case depended heavily on forensic interpretation. A major issue was the interpretation of the bloodstains on his shirt, specifically whether they were high-velocity impact spatter from a gunshot or transfer stains from contact with the victims. In addition, the reliability of the bloodstain pattern analysis was questioned. The prosecution's expert, Rod Englert, did not personally examine the crime scene, and instead he sent his photographer, Robert Cities, to document it. Cities not only documented the scene but also provided his own interpretation, although his qualifications in bloodstain analysis were later challenged. Englert then presented the analysis in court based largely on photographic evidence, which may have raised concern about the accuracy of the interpretation. Furthermore, there were competing expert testimony in this case. The prosecution's expert interpreted the bloodstains as high-velocity spatter, suggesting that Camm was the shooter. In contrast, the defense expert argued that the stains were transfer stains, indicating innocent contacts with the victims. As a result, the same evidence led to different conclusions, which created confusion in court. Overall, these challenges made the case highly complex and dependent on accurate forensic interpretation.
The core of the initial analysis were high-velocity impact spatter. This can be explained by the physics of blood behavior when a high-energy event like a gunshot hit a blood source. It overcomes the surface tension of the blood, shattering it into thousands of tiny droplets. These droplets are usually 0.1 mm to 1 mm in diameter. On Camm's shirt, the prosecution identified 8 of these microscopic spots. They argued that this was black spatter. In a shooting, blood can fly backward toward the weapon. By finding this spot on Camm's sleeve, the state argued that he was within the hot zone of the fire line. They use a technique called stringing to trace the trajectories back to the victim. claiming the map proved Camm was the shooter. During the final trial, the prosecution shifted focus to magnify analysis of David Camm's shoes to allege a forensic cover-up. State analysts argue that blood on Camm's shoes showed a horizontal toe-to-heel trajectory, proving he was moving through the scene during the shooting. They also identified a skeletonized stain, a drop dry at the edge with a missing center, claiming Camm had actively tried to wipe his shoes and clean off evidence. Summary: the shoe bloodstain analysis failed for the same reason the tissue analysis did. The prosecution isolated tiny, microscopic anomalies like a skeletonized edge or horizontal trajectory and engineered criminal narrative around them. They argue that Camm was trying to wipe away evidence of the shooting, completely ignoring the fact that panicked husband moving through a bloody garage to administer CPR were naturally smudged, wiped, and stabbed in the blood.
However, the initial interpretation of the bloodstains were later re-evaluated by other forensic experts. Upon further analysis, the stains on Camm sheets were found to be inconsistent with high-velocity impact vector. Instead, they were identified as transfer stains by defense expert, which occur when a surface comes into contact with blood. Supporting this, previous studies have shown that blood trickling through fabric can form small beads that, when transferred onto another surface, may produce patterns similar to high-impact vector. In addition, forensic literature highlight that aspirated blood can also produce patterns that may be misinterpreted as impact pattern. This emphasizes the importance of interpreting bloodstain pattern within full context of the crime scene to avoid misclassification. The linear arrangement of the stain also contradicts the typical conical pattern of impact pattern and is more consistent with transfer from contact with his child's blood-soaked hair. Further inconsistencies were observed in the stain patterns. No high-velocity spectre was found on Camm's shorts, which would be expected if he had been close to a shooting. This absence strengthens the argument that the stains resulted from the transfer rather than impact spectre. The defense also highlighted the inconsistency in the bloodstains on the Camm's jeans shoes, where stains were present in both sides but not on the front, contradicting the expected pattern if he had been the shooter. These findings significantly undermine the reliability of the initial interpretation. Following the re-evaluation of the evidence, Camm's conviction was overturned, and subsequent DNA analysis revealed that the genetic material on the grey sweatshirt found matched Charles Boney. This finding altered the direction of the case as it introduced an alternative suspect with no direct link to Camm. Boney was later convicted as an accomplice to the murders. At the third trial, the reliability of bloodstain evidence was further challenged, as expert witness Robert Scheller highlighted that the limited number of stains was insufficient for a definitive conclusion and that the analysis lacked scientific rigor.
David Camm was arrested and charged for murder in 2000 on the 1st October, which is 3 days after his family were killed at their home. He was brought on trial 3 times. In the first trial in 2002, he was convicted based mainly on bloodstain pattern analysis, which is testified by Robert Cities. However, in 2004, the Indiana Court of Appeal overturned the conviction after ruling that the affair evidence had unfairly biased the jury. In the second trial in 2006, he was convicted again and sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. By this time, Charles Boney has been arrested in 2005 and identified as a potential accomplice. The prosecutors argued that David Camm committed the murder to conceal legal abuse involving his daughter. Nevertheless, David Camm appealed the conviction and was granted a new trial by Indiana Supreme Court due to lack of a proper evidence supporting the allegation. In the final trial in 2013, David Camm was acquitted of all charges after Charlie Boney testified to action that implicated himself rather than David Camm. Therefore, the jury concluded that the bloodstain pattern analysis used by the prosecution was unreliable and insufficient to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. As a result, David Camm was finally released after spending 30 years in prison. The David case has been highlighted several important recommendations for forensic investigation, which is, firstly, forensic evidence must be scientifically reliable and carefully interpreted. In this case, the bloodstain pattern analysis was later considered unreliable and led to wrongful conviction, demonstrating the need for validation methods and qualified experts. In addition, investigators should remain objective and consider all possible suspects and evidence throughout the investigation process. In this case, investigators focused heavily on the bloodstain pattern on David Camm showing in the first place and overlooked Charles Boney, whose DNA was later connected directly to the crime scene. This case also emphasized that it is crucial to have forensic experts to prevent wrongful conviction in unfair trials. Bloodstain pattern analysis BPA plays a crucial role in forensic investigation because it assists investigators in reconstructing events of crimes, strengthening forensic evidence presented in court, and also identifying whether the crime scene has been altered or staged. Through the examination of the size, shape, distribution, and the location of the bloodstains, forensic experts can determine the direction of the blood movement, the position of victim and suspect, the weapon used, the time of force and angle at which the victim was hit, and the consequences of event at the crime scene.
In the case of David Camm, bloodstain pattern analysis was used by the prosecution to argue that David Camm was in proximity to the victims when the shooting occurred. Nevertheless, the case showed the limitation of bloodstain pattern analysis when interpretations are not supported by scientific validation. Different forensic experts presented conflicting interpretation of the bloodstain pattern found on David Camm's shirts and subsequently reviews questions and the reliability of the analysis. Thus, this case highlights the importance of applying validated forensic methods, forensic experts, and supporting evidence to ensure the accurate investigation and prevent wrongful convictions.
In conclusion, the David Camm case shows the serious consequences of relying on weak forensic evidence and biased investigations. It highlights the importance of accurate forensic analysis, proper DNA testing, and fair legal procedures in the justice system. Although David Camm was eventually acquitted, he lost 13 years of his life in prison for crimes he did not commit. This case reminds us that mistakes in criminal investigations can destroy innocent lives and emphasize the need for integrity and professionalism in forensic science and law enforcement. Thank you for listening.